Hello and welcome to That Bible Guy. We have a new teaching series. The new teaching series is now going to be on the book of Romans, and it's going to be a build up to our UK wide teaching day. We're on the book of Romans, which I'll be doing in about a month or so's time, maybe 6 weeks' time. So, this is the first of, I'm going to go through all the chapters of Romans and do a little short, just the bones of the teaching really, for what I'll fill in on the UK teaching day. So this is just a chapter, maybe one or two chapters a week on the book of Romans. Today what we are going to look at is Romans chapter 1. And we're going to look at, there's three things in this chapter. I mean, there's so many things in this chapter. But what I'm going to look at specifically, why is the world so evil? Why is the world so evil? But before we get to that, let's deal with a couple of things in Romans chapter 1 first of all. And then we'll look at why is the world so evil. So the first thing I want this to look at in Romans chapter 1. So we know that Paul wrote this letter to the Christians in Rome. And he says a few things at the opening part of the chapter, the salutations, the introductory parts of the chapter. He says a few things, and I was reading it recently, and I just spotted something that Paul says so many times at the beginning of Romans. So he says at Romans chapter 1, he says at verse 1, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be called an apostle. Then in verse 5 he says, through him we receive grace, Jesus, an apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith. If you spotted this, see if you spot this. Verse 6 he then says, and you also are among those Gentiles who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. And then in verse 7 he says, to all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his holy people. Putting that emphasis there. In every verse it says the same thing. In just 7 verses, 4 of them, it uses the term called. He says that Paul, a servant, was called to be an apostle. And again, verse 5, it says, apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith. Verse 6, and you also are among those Gentiles who are called to belong to Jesus Christ, and all in whom you are loved by God and called to be his holy people. So Paul repeatedly uses this phrase at the start of the book of Romans, which is probably his most well-known letter, which I'm going to term God's great gift to humanity. So the book of Romans, I'm going to term the whole series God's great gift to humanity. But this specific little starting point for Paul here is, I want you to know, I'm telling you that I'm called, and that you Gentiles that I'm reaching out to are also called, and to all in Rome, we're called to be God's holy people. So I want you to know, you're not just here by chance. You're not just following Christ because there's nothing better to do, because you happen to fall into it. You get in, you kind of sneaked in, but nobody knows that you're here. You were specifically called. Now, it doesn't mean a predestination call that only some people are called. We're all called, but not all listen. My parents go out of the house and they call all the children in, and only 2 of them come in. Did that mean only 2 of them were called? No, they were all called, but only 2 responded. So it says all you Christians today, you got to understand, you've been called by God. You've been called to be holy. You've been called and given a purpose the way Paul was called to be an apostle. The second thing I want to look at in this chapter, and only chapter 1, and say there's so many things that we could look at here. The second thing, and this is incredible, and when you think about the subject of Paul and his evangelism and our evangelism, he says in verse 14 in chapter 1, he says, I'm obligated both to Greeks, excuse me, Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and to the foolish. That's why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. So Paul says here an interesting phrase. He says, I'm obligated, both the Greeks, non-Greeks, wise and the foolish. What does he mean? In some of the older versions, it said, I am bound to. And he says, that's why I'm eager to preach the gospel. So he's talking about preaching the gospel to Greeks and non-Greeks. Wise, foolish, as he called them, barbarians, the Greeks' view of those who weren't Greeks. And he says, I have to preach the gospel to everyone. But he says, I'm obligated. I'm bound. So what he's saying here is, my evangelism is not an optional extra. It's an obligation. The word obligation, the proper translation here, is best rendered, they say, that I'm a debtor. So I'm a debtor. So I'm in debt. So I'm obligated. I'm in debt. Now, there's 2 ways to be in debt. You can borrow money and you simply owe that person the money back. The second way to be in debt is if I was to say to you, yes, you, here's £20, pass that on to someone that you know. Now, You're like, usually you would say, I'm going to see them, so okay, that's okay then. Now, I've made you in debt to that person. So you're in debt to that person till you pass on what I've given you to pass on to them. And that's the way that Paul felt. God had given him a calling, God had given him everything. He was in debt until he passed that on. And that's what he meant. I'm in debt to the Greeks, the non Greeks, the wise, the foolish. I'm in debt to everyone until I pass on to them the good news of the gospel. I must pass this on. So the question for us in the back of this, obligated, bound, in debt to, who do we feel in debt to as Christians? Do we feel that level of responsibility? You've been given something, you simply must pass on. You can't keep that £20 I gave you for somebody else. It wouldn't be right. You cannot keep to yourself what I've given to you to pass on to someone else. So that's the second thing we'll look at today. The last thing, the point in this video was, why is the world so evil? I'm not going to answer that fully today. It's not a massively apologetic lesson here, but we'll touch on it today based on Romans 1 here. Why is the world so evil? Why do these things happen? Why do people like this today? We've all, no doubt, had that thought. And what we look at in 1 here, it's really from verse 18 all the way down to 32. The descent of man. Why it all goes wrong. And we'll look at some of the reasons why here, why it all goes wrong. And I just want to pick out some of the points. It talks about the wrath of God being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness. First thing to say on this, it says wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Wickedness and sin, sinful living suppresses the truth. It simply does, whether we realize it or not. When we live a sinful life, an ungodly life, a wicked life, whether we like it or not, it simply does suppress the truth. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say here is that God has made himself plain. It said he's from the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made so that people were without excuse. So God has made himself clear and evident to people. He's made himself clear. He's made himself plain to the world. So the idea that God exists is a logical conclusion from all that we can see that has been made. It's the perfectly logical conclusion, and God has made himself plain. What does that also mean? As it says here, people are without excuse. People don't really have excuses for not believing in God because he's made himself clear and evident. We can do many more talks and videos on that God has made himself clear. Verse 21, it says, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, their foolish hearts were darkened. It says, here's the thing, and I've had this from street conversations and family conversations. As a whole, most people believe in something. Most people, if at a stretch, believe there's a God. They might not want to subscribe to your God as they see it, but they believe in a God. Now, so what it's saying here is, although they knew God, people generally believe that there's a God there somewhere. But their problem, as it says here, is they won't glorify him or give him thanks. That's the issue. The issue is not that they won't believe in him. It's that they don't want to believe in a God that they have to glorify, a God that they have to give thanks to, that they have to surrender to, that they have to obey. They want to do it on their own terms. And that's what it's saying here. They knew God, but they wouldn't glorify him or give thanks. And then now we have the descent of man. They know he's there, he's made himself obvious, but they won't worship him or give him thanks. Then we have the slide. Then it all starts to go wrong from there. And it tells us, claim to be wise, they exchanged the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man. Verse 24, and it says this in verse 24, 26, and 28. It says this in 3 places. It says, therefore, as a result of God not giving God thanks, glory that he's clearly due, it says he gave them over. And it talks about different ways that God gave them over. And you think, well, what on earth does that mean? Giving them over. That's not a strange concept. God loves us and he wants to shower his love upon us. But if we're rebellious children and we refuse to listen to him, we refuse to acknowledge who he is, and we do that and we continue to do that. Imagine a rebellious child. You try to help the child, maybe they're on drugs, alcohol, they're living a terrible life. You try to help them, but they won't listen. You keep trying to help them, but they're getting more and more destructive. don't want anything to do with you. They won't listen to your rules. They're in your house, living with you. You're their child. You love them. But they will not listen, and you cannot help them anymore. And in some instances, you have no other option but to do what? Give them over. You still love them. You still want to welcome them with open arms. But because of their lifestyle, the way they think, the rebellious nature, the way they're living, you've no other option but to give them over. God had no other choice but to give over those who refuse to listen to him, refuse to give thanks, refuse to glorify him. As a result, God gave them over to various things. That a rebellious child that you love, that you have no other option but to let them go their own way, life will get worse for them. They'll maybe not have no roof over their head anymore. They'll maybe not have anyone in their corner to watch out for them in the ways that they don't even realize right now. See, God gave them over to sinful desires. And it talks a lot about homosexual relationships and just general sexual debauchery here. God gave them over. That's the end result. The other end results is unnatural relations, again, sexual impurity, shameful acts. And it says here where it ends up going in verses 29 to 31. God gave them over. What was the end result? Well, the end result, verses 29 to 31 here, it says, they become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant. So the eventual outcome of God giving them over is verses 29 to 31. It says they become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. Gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they knew God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, that sin deserves punishment, they not only continue to do these very things, but they also approve of those who practice them. And I've seen this in the world. And look, Christians aren't perfect and do everything right, and all non-Christians are not all like this in every respect. But the general point here that we would make is, why is the world so evil? Why are people living like this? Why is there no love? Why is there no mercy, compassion? Why do people not strive after these attributes like Jesus did? The greatest, most loving, caring man that ever existed. Why do people not love these particular qualities? Well, God unfortunately has given the world over. Why is there so much evil? Romans 1:18 to 32 tells us to give people over. We'll be back soon with Romans 2. If you find this helpful in any way today, please share this on for other people to hear. Please like and subscribe to That Bible Guy. Please like the video. And please join the ministry on Patreon, where you'll get additional, hopefully, bonus footage on some of these Romans videos as well. And thanks very much for listening today. And let's get his word out there.